Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Silicon Valley E-Club of Rotary weekly meeting. We'd like to welcome everyone both online and in the Zoom group. We are part of the Rotary International organization, over 1.2 million members across the world, and we always put service above self. And so with that, I'd like to discuss today's meeting and provide an introduction to Rushton, who needs no introduction, to provide an introduction to this week's guest.
Awesome, Raj. Thank you very much. So everyone, welcome. I hope you are excited to get another week's worth of inspiration from us. And for our speaker today, you read his bio coming in. I'll just say he's in Melbourne and he's a cool guy. And add that he runs this organization called Future Crunch, which puts out a weekly newsletter, which I read religiously because it is that moment every week when I feel like there is hope for humanity. It's an opportunity to learn about strides forward in energy and technology and civil rights and more, all kinds of news that is the kind of stuff you don't normally get to see. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our speaker, Gus Hervey. Thank you, Gus, so much for being part of this, and we love that you're with us today. Hand the mic to you.
Great, thanks so much, Rushton, and thank you very much to the Rotary Club for having me. It's great to be able to share some of this news with you today. I'm really honored to be participating in this call, and thanks to everyone who's jumped on board, including a few of you who are coming in from time zones that are pretty outrageous. So it's wonderful to be with all of you. So. I'm a political economist by training. I actually did my PhD at the London School of Economics many years ago. And these days, I guess the best way you could describe what I do is that I'm a journalist. And I run an organization called Future Crunch, as Rushton's described to you over here. And what we are, we're a media and thought leadership company with a simple mission to discover what's happening on the cutting edge of science and technology and to share stories of progress. Our work at Future Crunch is all about helping people understand what's coming next as we move into a new era. Although, in all fairness, it doesn't really feel like much of a new era at the moment. It actually feels more like a bad episode of Black Mirror. The script writers are all on strike. Everything feels like it's in bullet time. And the only thing we know for sure is that there's another plot twist coming up. We can't predict the next 5 days, never mind the next 5 years. Let's take a look at some of the headlines, some of the things that have been happening around the world. I mean, you've seen the news recently, right? Interest rate rises, galloping inflation, supply chain disruption. Shipping costs are through the roof, the energy bills are insane, and now this morning, news just in that the Queen has passed away.
This is BBC News from London. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
The war in Ukraine dragging into its 7th month. Europe's facing a freezing winter without gas after Russia just cut off the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Food shortages mounting around the world as grain shipments get stuck in ports and crops get destroyed by increasingly crazy weather conditions. In the United States, historians are warning of an impending democratic crisis as the red and the blue states drift further apart. And China is dealing with a property crisis at home while sounding increasingly aggressive abroad. All of this, of course, happening against a backdrop of mounting environmental crises. Floods in Pakistan, wildfires in the United States and Europe, ice sheets melting in Greenland, heat waves in Europe and China. It's the steady drumbeat in the background of climate doom. Oh, and did I mention the robot dog with a rocket launcher strapped to its back? This was spotted at an international arms fair a few weeks ago. I mean, nothing to worry about here, right? Don't panic anymore. Oh, don't touch the robot. Don't touch that dog. Wow. As you can see, as is self-evident, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. This is a terrible time to be alive. Humanity is failing on multiple fronts, and we are all headed for the exits. Or so that's what you'd think if you were watching the evening news. Here, though, is some other news that you might not have heard about. Togo become the first country in the world to eliminate 4 neglected tropical diseases: lymphatic filariasis, human African tryptomyosis, trachoma, and dracunculitis. All 4 were eliminated in just 11 years. Countries in Southeast Asia, according to the World Health Organization, have now made substantial progress towards eliminating measles. When was the last time you saw measles in the headline? It's probably because measles cases somewhere are going up, and yet the WHO says that measles cases declined by 92% in Southeast Asia between 2002 and 2020. That's a decrease of 97% in death rates, and it saved an estimated 9.3 million lives. Humanity is making steady progress towards eliminating mother-to-child transmission of hepatitis. Thanks to increased vaccinations, we've seen a 10% increase in the number of countries worldwide that's giving vaccinations to children as newborns. And global efforts to fight malaria are yielding impressive results too. An estimated 10.6 million malaria deaths averted between 2000 and 2020. And global leaders and African heads of state just rallied over $4 billion of funding towards the effort to end malaria in the next 10 years. Global electricity access rose from 83% to 91% of the world's population in the last decade, although it did slow down during the pandemic because people couldn't get to those underserved populations. Global child mortality down by 60% in the past 3 decades. The number of children dying before the age of 5 annually has decreased from 12.6 million to 5 million. That's the most extraordinary news story, and yet we just don't hear about it in the evening news. Did you know that same-sex marriage just took a big step closer to being legalized in Japan, the Czech Republic, Thailand, and Slovenia? And in the United States, the number of Americans living without health insurance just hit a record low of 8%, thanks to extra federal funding during the pandemic. America's inequality problem just improved for the first time in a generation. The bottom 50% of households now earn more of a share of the national wealth than they have in 20 years. That's because of trillions of dollars of COVID-19 relief, but also because of the increasingly strong labor market in the United States. And tolerance is improving as well. Pennsylvania just banned conversion therapy, which means that 20 states across the US have now completely banned a practice that was commonplace just a few years ago. School children across California are now eligible for free breakfast and lunch when they return to class in September, regardless of immigration status or income status. California has also become the first place to provide undocumented residents over the age of 55 with state-subsidized food benefits, and the first state to guarantee free healthcare for all low-income immigrants, regardless of their legal status. Here's a simple but very important observation, which is that on almost every single social issue, from women's rights to racial tolerance, minority rights, immigration and religion, gun ownership and abortion, Americans, in fact, today are more tolerant than they have been at any point in their history. It's just that their governing and legal institutions have been captured by a fringe minority who is not. In America, the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest investment in climate action in US history, hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to turbocharge the race to avert climate change, reducing 40% of American reductions by 2030. And the subsidies for the Inflation Reduction Act are going to make clean energy cheaper everywhere in the world. Did you know that the Inflation Reduction Act also contains the largest amount of conservation funding in US history? Billions of dollars for things like drought resilience, water management, climate resilience for tribal lands, urban and community forestry, conservation in national forests, conservation for national parks. America has never had this much funding dedicated towards conservation in a single bill. The last bill that dedicated that kind of funding towards conservation was the Great American Outdoors Act, which was passed 2 years ago. 220 projects enacted since then, $3.8 billion of spending. It's created over 36,000 jobs in national parks across the United States. Why is that not a story that we hear more about? And in Europe, everyone is talking about how Russia is cutting off the gas, but no one is talking about the obvious corollary, which is that renewables ambition is now rising across those European Union member states. 19 European states have accelerated their clean energy plans since the Russian invasion. As I like to say, Vladimir Putin is a climate hero. He has arguably done more to accelerate the clean energy transition than any person alive today. Solar records have been broken throughout Europe. 18 out of 27 European countries just broke their solar records over the last summer. Europe generated a record 12% of its energy from solar. That's up from 9% last year. That's 29 billion euros that they saved in avoided fossil gas. China built nearly 31 gigawatts of new solar power capacity in the first half of this year. That's up by over a quarter compared to last year. And the country's total capacity is now 340 gigawatts. China also just announced 570 gigawatts of wind and solar for the next 5 years. That puts the Inflation Reduction Act, it makes it look like small fry. It's 10 times Africa's capacity, 1 times Asia's capacity, 1 times the EU, 1 times North America, and 2 times South America, all by 2025. America's just hit a tipping point on EV adoption. 5% of all sales now of new cars are electric vehicles. Guess which states have the highest electric vehicle growth since 2014? California and New York aren't even in the top 5. Leading the pack is Mississippi, followed by Hawaii, Utah, Maryland, and Wyoming. Lawmakers in Europe have voted to ban internal combustion engines in all new cars and vans by 2035, and of course, so has California. And China sold more than 500,000 electric vehicles in June this year. That's 28% of market share. At this pace, 50% of market share of new cars in China will be fully electric by 2025. Colombia has become the first country in the Western Hemisphere to protect 30% of its ocean. It's also just launched a new initiative to protect 32 million hectares of protected areas in the next decade. Niue, the Pacific Island state, has just protected all of its territorial waters. That's an area the size of Vietnam. Did you know that the population of saiga antelope in Kazakhstan has rebounded tenfold after a fatal disease killed half that population 7 years ago? Tigers are having a pretty good year as well. Officials in Nepal have announced that numbers have more than doubled in the last decade. And the number of wolf packs has jumped by more than 25% in the Alps in the last year. And in America, indigenous tribes across the country have brought bison populations back from the brink of extinction. Today, 76 tribes across 20 states manage more than 20,000 bison. An incredible achievement considering that the population sat below 1,000 in the early 1900s. All of those stories, by the way, have happened in the last 3 months. So why don't we hear about it in the evening news? I'm not saying here that the world is some kind of perfect place and that everything is going swimmingly for humanity. I mean, many things are obviously going horribly wrong. Intolerance, war, migration crises, economic hardships, drought, famine, poverty, these things continue to haunt our species. And it's also true that this incredible progress that I've talked here about today hasn't reached everyone. Far too many people still live in extreme poverty. 5 million children still die unnecessarily every year of preventable diseases. And hundreds of millions of people cannot access the basic freedoms that we all take for granted. But you have to be able to hold two ideas in your head at once. The world is getting better, and the world isn't good enough yet. Our successes in the past and our continued successes should give us confidence that we can overcome the challenges that we face today. And a big portion of the blame for the reason that we can't see these stories lies with the media. Let me show you what I mean by this. Here's a fantastic quote by G.K. Chesterton, the famous journalist, who showed us that what we're talking about here is nothing new. Journalism doesn't announce the happiness of mankind. Busy editors can't report the permanent miracles, the disasters that don't befall us. They can only represent the unusual. And bad news is what is unusual. Bad news is what gets our attention. We've created a media machine whose business model relies on grabbing our attention. And of course, our attention is always grabbed by things that are dangerous and scary. It's not just that, though. It's also that the volume of information we're receiving these days has increased exponentially. Let me show you a very good example of this. We all know that homicides in New York are becoming an increasing problem. Mayor Adams just ran on that entire platform, the rising crime rates in New York. It was a national story across the United States. And yet, if you look at the evidence, this is what the homicide rate in New York looks like over the last maybe 3 or 4 decades. Sorry, over the last 2 decades or 3 decades or so. And what you can see is that there's been a slight uptick over the course of the pandemic, but by historical levels, it's still incredibly low. And yet, despite the fact that those homicide rates have essentially stayed the same, media reporting of those homicides has increased exponentially. So here, what you're looking at is coverage of the number of shooting incidents that are happening in New York. So the level of crime has stayed the same, but the media coverage of that crime has increased, which means that people's perception of that crime has been completely skewed. Everyone now thinks that crime is a problem in New York because the media is reporting more of it. And this principle, you see this in action across almost every sphere of human activity today. Conservation, human progress, human development, clean energy. We only ever report the bad news because that's what gets people's attention. And of course, we all live in an attention economy. And what that means is that most of today's information is kind of like junk food. It's the nutritional equivalent of corn syrup and jelly babies. It's engineered to be addictive. It temporarily satisfies our urges, but it actually has minimal nutritional value. News and social media are like fast food for the mind. And just as with junk food, our brains and bodies aren't really evolutionarily equipped to process it. So what do you do about a problem like that? Well, that's why we started Future Crunch. We really try to see if we can break this bad news bias. And as Rushton said over here, each week we put together an email newsletter, and it's filled with stories of human progress from every corner of the world, the latest breakthroughs from the frontiers of science and technology, and what we think is the best thought leadership from around the web. It's our way of constantly challenging ourselves to update our ideas about how the world works and to prove to ourselves that there are incredible stories of progress everywhere you look if you could just be bothered to try. And on a personal level, what I've found in doing this for the last 7 years is that it's completely altered my perception of the world that we live in. I now find that I can step through the world with a level of innate optimism that the future might be better. Not necessarily that the future will be better, but that I believe that we as a species can do it. Optimism, as I like to say, isn't a reaction to the world around you. It's a choice by which you can navigate the world. And when you make that choice, everything looks different. So what I'm wanting to do here today, if you'd like to get that kind of news in your inbox, I'd like to offer all Rotary Club attendees a free 1-month subscription. All you have to do is go to this website or just scan this QR code. And I'll make sure that that link is available to everyone after this presentation as well. And also just encourage you, even if you don't sign up to that newsletter, to start maybe trying to keep an eye out for some of those good news stories. As I said, they are everywhere you look. You just need to make the decision to have that as your lens on the world. So with that, I'll hand back over to Rushton and everyone who's on this call here today. And thank you very much for having me.
Gus, wonderful to have you. I'd like to introduce the group that we have got as part of the recording today, because we represent a lot of different time zones. So good fun for that. In addition to Gus in Melbourne, Australia, we have in Texas, as I read across my screen, Rory Olson. We have in California, Raj Bhandari. We have in Oregon, Heather Edwards. We have in Canada, Chris Cochran, and we have in Italy, Cecilia Babkirk. So to get the questions started, I'd like to point out that there is an element of the Future Crunch newsletter that you didn't talk about. Granted, you were putting a lot of material together in that, so thank you for that. And that's that there is this section at the end that that has to do with like an example of somebody who's really done something good in the world. And you know, you like that we had a speaker at one point talking to us about Skatistan, I think, that I learned about through one of the newsletters. And those stories I find particularly poignant each week. So could you talk a little bit about that element of the newsletter?
Sure. Thanks, Rush. So that's a section in our newsletter that we call Humankind, which is obviously a bit of a play on words, but actually was inspired by a wonderful book by a Dutch historian named Rutger Bregman. And he wrote a book called Humankind. And the premise of this book is that the average human being on planet Earth is a pretty good person. Most people are kind, generous, tolerant, and that's what most people are like. It's just that we don't hear about those people, because the people that appear in the news are either famous for being notorious for having really great bone structure, or for doing something awful politically. And so what we try to do in this Humankind section is we try to profile an individual person from somewhere in the world, and we always profile someone from a different country who's either done something great for the environment or who's done something great for fellow people. And once again, it's incredible once you start looking for those kinds of people, how many of them are out there. So it's our way of saying these are the ones that should be famous rather than the people that are famous.
Nice. Another element of the newsletter that really strikes me is the focus that you have on energy, right? The idea, not simply that, hey, there's more renewables, but there are so many layers to the onion of renewable energy, right? To be in that space of understanding like what kind of strides are being made in places like China or elsewhere, and to understand that there are these added complexities. I remember in one of the newsletters a discussion essentially about the hand-wringing that was going on after the Reykjavik conference, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that as an example for getting people to understand, you know, a larger, longer-term picture.
Sure. So energy is my personal passion. I'm an unashamed energy geek, and I spend a lot of time on Twitter, in a part of Twitter called Energy Twitter, which is where people love to throw numbers around, and a lot of it's impenetrable, but is also incredibly hopeful. Energy is this really interesting space where right now, most people in the world have never felt more in despair in terms of where we're going on climate change. And yet in the energy world, most energy activists and people in the climate space have never been more hopeful. And that's a really interesting dichotomy. And the reason for it is that about 2 or 3 years ago, we kind of crossed this really crucial tipping point where the question was no longer, is clean energy cheaper than dirty energy? That question got fully solved 2 or 3 years ago, where we passed the point at which clean energy is now definitively cheaper than dirty energy. The question now is, how fast can we deploy? And so we've switched into what some people call the third phase of the clean energy revolution, where it's not so much about activism and not so much about stopping fossil fuels as it is about replacing them with the cheaper alternative. And what's really interesting now is that the logic for replacing fossil fuels now is entirely economic, which turns out to be a far better motivator than telling people to keep it in the ground, because that's a bad thing to do. And so across the world, the clean energy revolution now is really starting to ramp up. And I think you only have to look at some of the headlines that are coming out, but also on a deeper level as well. We're seeing progress in areas like industrial emissions, transportation emissions with electric vehicles. The electric vehicle revolution is going way quicker than even the most optimistic analysts predicted. We're seeing all the world's big emitters, India, the United States, Europe, and China, all really lean full steam into this energy revolution. They have some of the most ambitious climate targets in the world. And where this is all leading, and our kind of thesis at Future Crunch, is that if you think the digital revolution was a big deal, wait until you replace the foundational civilizational stack upon which humanity operates, which is, of course, the energy stack. The energy revolution is going to make the digital revolution look like the warm-up.
Fantastic. Chris, in Canada, I believe you have a question.
Yeah, you mentioned a bit about economics. I'm just curious, does Future Crunch face financial challenges?
That's a great question. So the answer to that question is that good news is a terrible business model.
Yeah, I'm looking up the CNN Great Big Story model. They were going wonderfully,
Yeah.
but they closed down for economic reasons.
Yeah, look, it's a fantastic question. So our experience in the last 7 years is that good news does not sell. That's why nobody sells it. So what we've done is we've come up with a bit of a different funding structure where the majority of our income as a business actually comes from speaking. We do quite a lot of public speaking all around the world, mostly in the United States and Australia and a little bit in Europe. And then what we also do is that with the newsletter, we have a paid subscription tier. And what we try to do with that is we try to get people who read the newsletter to fund our efforts to find and promote that good news. But for us, crucially, and perhaps even more importantly, it's really critical for us to put our money where our mouth is. It's all very well to talk about good news, but we actually want to make it happen. So what we do, let me see if I can show you over here, is we have a charity arm. Let's just see it. So hopefully you can see that over here. And what we do is we take 1/3 of the revenues that we get from our newsletter and we donate that to small charities who are using science and technology somewhere in the world to make the world a better place. We've funded plastic sort of recovery machines in refugee camps in Algeria. We've funded ranger groups in Kenya with some equipment. We've done things like fund telescopes for children in Zimbabwe. We've done prosthetics for kids in the Philippines. We try to find these small, under the radar kind of charities and then send them $5,000 or $10,000, which is not a huge amount, but for those charities, it makes a big difference. And we just say to them, hey, what do you need? Here's an amount, spend it on whatever you want. Don't worry about giving us, fancy grant applications or anything like that. And I think what's so nice for us about that is it means that our community of readers is actively engaged in making the world a better place rather than just reading about it. So that's our financial model. We're certainly never going to retire to an island in the Bahamas on that. But it certainly makes us feel like we're giving back and making a contribution in this wider conversation.
So just as a follow-up then, if Rotarians wanted to give you money, would you accept it? And if so, how could we send it?
Absolutely. Well, we would love that. The best way you can support us is by signing up for a paid subscription to that newsletter. But failing that, if people are interested in donating to the actual individual charities, which you can all find on our Future Crunch websites, there's a tab in all of them that says charity. If you're interested in donating to those individual charities, or even just donating a set amount and letting us decide which charity that goes to, we are always open to that, and we have the ability to direct that payment. Just contact us.
Thank you.
Good deal. A question came in from Italy, as it happens, from Cecilia, and this may prove quite the challenging question for you. Can you comment on the situation in Ukraine? Is it really as bad as it appears? It appears to have turned the world upside down, but is there a better story behind the scenes in terms of the future of humanity?
Look, the Ukraine, it's a very difficult situation we obviously have to fully recognize that the Ukrainian war is an absolute disaster. Millions of people have had to flee their homes. We've seen untold destruction across vast swathes of the country. People's lives, millions of lives have been ruined by the actions of Russia and the invasion. And Ukraine is still very much in a fight for its existence. There's nothing good about war. And yet, in and amongst that tragedy, there are silver linings. The first silver lining for me is that the Ukrainian resistance has outstripped the expectations of almost every observer. On the eve of the invasion, it's quite easy to forget now, but not a single military analyst in the world gave Ukraine even a fighting chance. And yet here we are 7 months later, Ukraine has managed to push Russia back to the east and to the south. And as we've seen in the last few days, is even now making incursions. And I think what this shows is just an incredible resilience of spirit and a willingness to face off against people who are invading your country. The second thing that I think has been really encouraging is that the invasion was almost universally condemned by most of the world's countries. Not all of the world's countries, of course, because there are still geopolitical considerations, but almost universally, the alliances that we all traditionally consider ourselves a part of, certainly the people on this call, NATO, Europe, the United States, and a number of other countries around the world, united to put sanctions on Russia and hopefully therefore deterring any would-be invaders of other countries in the future. And the third thing, the third silver lining that I think comes out of this is that that Russian invasion has done more to accelerate the clean energy transition than anything I can remember in living history. And the reason for that is that countries around the world have suddenly realized that clean energy isn't just nice to have because it makes the world cleaner and because it's cheaper, but clean energy is also more secure from a security point of view. So it's not just clean energy more now, and it's not just clean energy now, it's freedom energy. Another country cannot stop the wind blowing and the sun shining in your country, but it can cut off the oil and the gas. And so all around the world, we're now seeing countries accelerate their clean energy plans. And I think when we're looking at the long term, I think that's probably going to be the most important silver lining that comes out of this invasion.
So a final quick question for you before we wind things down, and that's from Rory. What are the subscription rates for your newsletter?
The subscription rate is $50 a year or $5 a month, and you can unsubscribe at any time. We might at some stage in the future open it up to a higher paid tier, but we want to try and make it as accessible as possible. And of course, we are always open. We understand people are struggling financially at the moment and things are a bit tricky. If people need a discount, maybe you're a pensioner or you know, you're a student, or maybe things, you know, the purse strings are tight, just send us an email and just say, hey, I can't afford it, and we'll work something out. We don't want people to not be able to access this information.
Wonderful. All right. So what we'll do is we'll wind things down before I hand it back to Gus for a final word, because we like to hand the mic back to the speaker as we finish up each week. But those of you who have joined us on this recording, let us know you were here. There is an attendance form just a little bit down the page, and you can, by typing in your name and your email address correctly, you can get a generated email that you can pass along to your club secretary to make up a miss. So we hope that you are taking advantage of that. And then even more so, a little farther down the page, you'll see our discussion section, the discuss forum. And that's where we leave thoughts about the different things that we learn in our programs and from the different elements of the meeting, and you can respond to others. And we ask that when in doubt, go with a question rather than a statement. Probably a good rule for life there. As we always do, we hand it back to our speaker for a final word. So Gus, what would you like people to have in their minds as they leave the recording?
Thanks very much, Rush, and thanks very much once again to everyone who's been on this call for some great questions, and thank you to the Rotary Club for having me. I think if I was going to leave you with any final idea, it's maybe just thinking about this word optimism. You know, in a world where everyone is increasingly cynical, where the news is telling us that everything is falling apart, and where the conversations, certainly at the national level in a lot of countries, is about how things are going really, really badly. Optimism in that kind of world is a really radical act. And it's an optimism that can be informed by facts, which is really what we try to do at Future Crunch. It's an intelligent, courageous, fact-based optimism, rather than a hold hands and sing kumbaya kind of optimism. And I think that kind of mindset is an incredibly powerful tool, because it's a gift not just to yourself, but to those around you. Optimism and courage are infectious. And the more of us that can embody those ideals, the more people we can spread that to, the more likely we are to be able to overcome some of these great challenges that we face in our time. So that's my invitation to everybody here. And once again, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Gus, and everyone. We will see you next week.